My buddy worked the graveyard shift as a security guard at the Terrell Insane Asylum, a state-funded hospital in a remote part of East Texas. One night around 11 p.m., I swung by the front security booth to drop off some cash for him. While there, I asked for a quick tour of the property. His stories about that place were legendary, and I figured seeing it firsthand would only add to the experience. As we drove through the campus, there were 6 or 7 large 5-story buildings. He gave me the rundown of each. But when we reached the last building, the original and oldest one on the property, he stopped the car about 100 yards away and refused to go any closer. I asked him why he wouldn't proceed, and then he told me the story that completely changed how he did his rounds. Shortly after taking the job, he was making his late-night patrol when he noticed a light on inside the retired building. It had been out of use for years and was now used strictly for storage, old medical equipment mostly. Knowing it had to have been left on by an employee earlier that day, he decided to go in and shut it off. The building was locked, so he used his key to enter and made his way up 4 flights of stairs. The hallways were dimly lit, lined with old doors from when the place had been active. The light he saw was coming from one of the last rooms toward the end. As he approached, he followed protocol, checking door handles along the way to ensure everything was locked up. Each one was secure. Reaching the last rooms, he stepped inside. The light was on, but nothing seemed out of place. He flipped the switch, closed the door, and locked it. But as he turned around to head back down the hall, he froze. Every door he had just checked, every single one, was now wide open. The hallway was dead silent. It was just rows of open doors that had been locked moments before. Without hesitation, he bolted down the stairs and out of the building. Once he was far enough away, he finally turned back around. The light he had just turned off was back on. I sat there when he told me, letting the stories sink in. As we drove back toward the front of the property, I casually glanced in the side mirror. The same light that he had just spoken of was on, as if hearing the story retold. Nope, I wanted nothing more to do with that place. I was out walking on the trails around the Nathan Hale homestead, an 18th century farmhouse and the property of a Revolutionary War hero in Connecticut. The site was only about a 10-minute drive from my grandmother's lake house, and I had always been curious about the trails. However, I couldn't find a map online, and there didn't seem to be any signage when I arrived. It was just a bunch of random mountain bike paths winding through the woods. I planned to walk a few miles and used my watch to keep track of my time. At first, everything seemed normal. It was around 9 on a Monday morning, and the only sounds were the distant hum of Route 31, birds chirping, and the occasional rustling of squirrels or deer when I passed too close. The trails twisted and turned unpredictably, and if not for my decent sense of direction, I could have easily gotten lost. About 20 minutes into my walk, I saw something unusual about 50 meters ahead. A finely polished, light-colored wooden coffin. I stopped, a bit unsettled. I waited until I got closer, rounding a bend where several old tree stumps had momentarily blocked my view. When I reached the spot, the coffin was gone. In its place was nothing but a cluster of ferns. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Maybe it had been a trick of the light, or my imagination was playing with the contrast between the trees. Still, it left me uneasy. Deciding I had walked far enough, I turned around and began making my way back toward the parking lot. I was maybe a half a mile away when I began to hear a distinct knocking sound on a tree nearby. The unmistakable rhythm of shave and a haircut. It was that exact rhythm, although without the two bits, almost like it was cut off. I stood there for a moment. My first thought was that it had to be a woodpecker, but the pattern was too deliberate. Before I could shake the feeling of unease, I heard it again, this time coming from a completely different tree ahead of me. I picked up my pace, walking faster. The trail widened, and in the distance I could see the entrance to the parking lot. Just as relief started to set in, the knocking began again, this time from a tree directly beside me. The sound was impossibly loud, like someone was striking the wood with an axe. At that moment, everything shifted. The temperature seemed to plummet at least 20 degrees, and the birds that had been singing only moments before had gone silent. Worse still, my simple Timex watch started glitching, beeping erratically as the numbers on the screen flickered and scrambled. Time seemed to slow down as I forced myself to keep moving. Then the knocking sound came again, echoing from multiple directions at once, like the entire forest had joined in. I practically jogged into the parking lot, and the moment I crossed the threshold, everything snapped back to normal. The temperature was warm again, and the birds were chirping, although my watch had gone completely blank. As I stood there staring at it, the screen suddenly flashed back to life, displaying 12 o'clock, Monday, January 1st. It had somehow completely reset itself. My stomach churned. I quickly got into my car and started the engine, glancing at the radio display. It also read 12, which made no sense. It should have been around 9:30 or 9:45 at the latest. As I shifted into reverse and backed out of my space, a sharp rapping sound hit my rear window. There had been no one else in the parking lot, no other cars, nothing. I didn't dare look back, and I hightailed it back to my grandmother's house. I have no idea what could have caused this series of events, and still cannot explain it to this day. I used to be in the military, and the training camp bunk we lived in was said to be haunted. At first, we didn't take it seriously, just the usual rumors and stories that get passed down from previous recruits. But as time went on, little things started happening that we couldn't explain. Occasionally our stuff would go missing and then reappear in strange places. It wasn't like someone was just moving things around for a joke. We'd find them in spots that made no sense, a locked locker under our bed, or zipped up inside a bag we hadn't even opened that day. It was weird, sure, but easy to chalk up to human error or someone messing around. None of us really thought much about it. But then there was this one night. It was late, well past lights out. Most of us were already lying down, half asleep except for one of my friends who was on his phone, secretly texting his girlfriend. Using our phones at night wasn't allowed, so when he heard the sound of shuffling feet in the corridor outside, he panicked. Thinking it was our sergeant making a surprise check, he quickly shoved his phone under his pillow, rolled over and pretended to be asleep. What happened next still chills me to the bone. As he lay there, keeping as still as possible, he heard someone walk up beside his bed. He said he could feel a presence, that someone was there. He kept his eyes shut, breathing slow and steady, trying to make it look like he was asleep. Then clear as day, a voice spoke right next to him. "Don't worry. you can continue to pretend to sleep. It wasn't our sergeant. It wasn't one of us. It was the voice of a young girl. I would have dismissed it as a trick of his imagination, maybe just his mind playing games in the dark. Except I heard it too. And I wasn't the only one. 5 other guys in the bunk room heard the same thing. The voice was soft, almost amused, but it wasn't familiar to any of us. And when my friend finally gathered the courage to open his eyes, it was nothing but dark. There was no one there. To make things even more chilling, there was no possible way for a child to be in that building. Our training camp was on an island, government controlled and closed off for military use. Civilians hadn't been allowed there for over 15 years. We were stationed deep in the forested area of the island, far from the main administrative blocks, and at that time, there were no female recruits or personnel assigned there. The only people present were us, all male trainees, and the few officers overseeing our training. The doors to our bunk were locked for the night, and nobody had come in. The duty sergeant was completely unaware of what had happened. There was no logical explanation for it. After that night, we never spoke of it again. Maybe because we didn't want to acknowledge it. Maybe because none of us wanted to admit how much it really did unsettle us. But even now, years later, whenever I think back to that moment, the eerie voice, the certainty that we were not alone, I get chills all over again. I don't know what we heard that night, but I know for sure that we weren't imagining it. We'll never know what, but something was there with us.